It's nice to sit in a park looking at the river, watching people go by, seeing signs of life. Guy over here to my right is playing his guitar. There's something since COVID I've recognized I've had to fight, and that is a real sluggishness. It's almost like lockdown has a hangover. And it's been tough. There's also this negativity that I have to constantly push back on. A perplexity, confusion. It's like whatever happened to us has left an imprint on all of our minds and bodies, to the point where we're constantly having to push back on it. I know I am. One of the things long-term or long-duration isolation creates is it has an effect, because of the stress levels over a period of time, on your ability to think with executive planning function, meaning linear. And that is how we navigate through the world in terms of time and the temporal. So moving through that space in these physical bodies, that's how we are able to interact and make sense of the world. And long duration stress, isolation, has definitive impacts on it. I'm still dealing with it. There was the original 11 months of the isolation and lockdowns, and then there was a 2-month period I went back down to the farm and was isolated again, and it was like trauma land in my head. And I find it very difficult to get out and do things. There's like a sense of mourning, an oppression, a darkness that kind of hangs over your mind. You have to fight daily just to be around people, interact, get out of the house. And it's like my body is constantly recovering and trying to retool from the stress and trying to make sense of what the hell's going on. And I can tell you a lot of things about what I've learned. And how I've learned it isn't just through due diligence, but it's also through experience, and learning to mine that experience in a way that allows me to have a contextual framework in which to place things in. But physically, even cognitively, psychologically, there is noticeable cycles of impairment, and an impairment that I'm constantly having to daily overcome. So when you think about that from the ability for people to navigate their times, and especially if they don't have a worldview foundation based in truth to uphold them, you can see how it would drive people quite literally insane. So that's one of the things that I've had to try to map out to make sense of why people are acting the way they are. In the context of spiritual, psychological, cognitive, and physiological realities. We're all broken to some degree. We're all trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense to many of us anymore. Regardless of worldview, regardless of points of view, regardless of knowledge base, educational level, whatever. But I can tell you from my experience, I'm not the same person as I was. Sensitivities are up, even though dealing with some of the effects of long COVID or whatever it is that they want to call it, I really think it's more to do with long-term isolation and the impacts upon our brains, our bodies, our ability to process information, and then a spiritual reality that is quite honestly excessively abusive, oppressive, deceptive. I know that one of the symptoms I have is I've lost some hearing in both my ears. Certain frequencies. My stress tolerances wax and wane, and some days are pretty good and other days are incredibly terrible. It's like there's something operating in my own flesh that comes and goes, and I say that in terms of a spiritual reality. Nothing seems to have any permanence. There's no consistency. There's no solidity. So when you're dealing with that stuff from a point of view of societal reality, I can tell you all kinds of things about how we got here, how it's affecting us. But I'm pretty impaired in many ways in terms of where to go from here, because I don't put trust into political systems, political realities, or people. I can't. People are broken, just like the rest of us, right? Everybody's got stuff they're dealing with. And I'm no different. And because people's stress tolerances are lower, it's created a reality where friendships, relationships are almost always under attack or in peril. And I've thought a lot about this from a Christian worldview. I've thought about what it means in Revelation 11 when John was told to measure the temple, but not the outer courtyard. The outer courtyard had been turned over to be trampled by the Gentiles or the beast for a time, times, and half a time. And we generally think of that in terms of a physical stone temple in Jerusalem. But you have to unhinge the New Testament and what it says about what the new temple really is and what Jesus says to be able to make that leap. But it does make more sense to me that the temple that's talked about in Revelation 11 and why John's told not to measure the outer courtyard because it's being trampled down, right? He's told to measure the rest of it, right? The heart, in this case, it would be your heart, your inside out, right? Not your outside in. It makes sense to me in that context from a spiritual point of view that spiritually people are being trampled down. After all, that's what the beast does to the whole world. It tramples the entire world. People have made a lot of assumptions about that, but when you think about how everybody's been poisoned and the systems have been co-opted and truth is being trampled, people's cognitive frame of reference has been crushed, their financial opportunities, their ability to make sense of the world around them, their own physical bodies. I have to say that from the perspective at which I'm viewing things across all those buckets, the spiritual, the physiological, the psychological, that trampling is happening both in the visible and unseen realms. Which is why it makes it so difficult, I think, for people to make sense of it, and makes it so easy for people that don't understand what I'm talking about to actually make faulty judgments and base their perceptions and their judgment calls upon outer appearances alone, unhinged from the spiritual reality of things. And there's a reason why Jesus warned about that. In a sense, I mean, that's what Job's friends were doing to Job. They were judging the outer appearances of things, not knowing what was going on spiritually behind the scenes, the deeper reality of things. So, consider what I'm talking about in this, you know. There are people that can't stand. We have a day of evil that has occurred upon us, and a lot of people can't stand. I think about how many people have been poisoned by drugs, by chemicals, food, bad information, right? Bad ideologies, and how vulnerable our bodies, our minds are to the technologies we create. See, I've always been very, very sensitive to all of these things, spiritually and otherwise, my entire life. I can map the patterns out and show you correlations and evidence that backs up my suppositions here. I can show you a plethora of science that backs up all these pieces. The problem is that it's from such a multi-vector. It's the problem is the complexity, right? Complexity. The external reality is complex, and it's even more complex when most people don't see it. So those people that do have an inkling of things in the spiritual are made to feel like they are insane, regardless of whether they can back up things with data or information or it makes logical sense and they provide information for people to test. But for Christians, I would challenge you to think about this. Those who worship God worship in truth and in spirit. But think about that. Truth and in spirit. From the inside out. Not the outside in. And so you're warned about judging things on externality by Jesus, and you're also told that in the end of the age that people would judge things, right? They would practice an outward form of religion, right? Things would be all about the externals. Now, I've used a lot of metaphors, a lot of things to talk about this, one being the shadow and the projection of one's shadow upon oneself and living out of the temporal alone, apart from the wisdom, knowledge, and truth of God that provides spiritual vision to see. And so if people are operating only in the shallows of the temporal, they're blinded to what I'm talking about, because everything they see, right, everything they base their perceptions on are based upon how things appear to be externally. I've also talked about in the past that people, when I bring this up, will think that that's a crazy notion in many cases. Yet, when I explain to them, well, how do you think your cell phone works? Do you see the signals? Do you see the transmissions? The RF connecting to the towers? Or the Wi-Fi signals? Do you see them? Yet it still works, does it? Does it not? Even though you don't see it. You see evidence of it by how it works, and you just assume that, it's doing what it's supposed to. Yet you can't prove, right, without tools, without instruments to be able to see into what you can't see with your naked eyes, that is the RF signals, into the electromagnetic spectrum, right? But you don't deny that it exists. Yet, when somebody talks about the spiritual reality of things, you do deny it exists. Works on the same principles, though. How do you know it doesn't exist? Maybe you just don't see it. Yet you accept things every day that you don't see. In a myriad of ways. You don't see thoughts. Thoughts are translated into communication, verbal, visual, auditory, right? Written, moving pictures, memes, right? All kinds of ways that are observable. But yet you don't deny that thought exists. Yet most people deny the spiritual reality beyond all of these things exists. Why do you think that is? You've been blinded to it. And because they don't perceive it, they refuse to even investigate it because they don't think it exists. Because they can't see it. They can't observe it. They can't see anything but the actual evidence of it. Yet the entire world is trying to trample that down so they can't even see the evidence of it in the visual, in the perceivable. That's what the reason why I'm bringing all these things up is that's what I mean by the temple of the living stones, which is God's people being trampled down, as spoken about in Revelation 11. It actually makes a lot of sense when you put it in that context, right? Because it makes things appear like the truth of the gospel is not true. Because the people, which are evidence of it, have been captured, beaten down, abused, whatever, right? That's a form of active slander, right? It's an eclipse, if you will, of the real thing. It's putting something that's not real in front of the real thing and then telling people the real thing doesn't exist while pointing to the thing that's standing in front of it, preventing people from actually viewing it. You see what I mean? Yet when you see a solar eclipse, you know the sun is there behind it. You can see the corona. You can see the evidence of it, right? You can still see around the edges of the moon the real thing. But people would attribute that back in ancient times and say that crown, that corona around the dark moon was the crown of the moon, when it was anything but. That's the nature of deception, false light. Well, that is also an example of your shadow deceiving you. You are, after all, in the valley of the shadow of death. The valley of decision. So what I'm getting at is that we've all been trampled down. We've all had definitive impacts to our minds and bodies. We've all had impacts that, in a sense, have shrouded us in some degree or another from people being able to see who we really are. And that is, in a sense, an eclipse. Now think about what I'm saying. So if I hide something from you by putting something in front of it so you cannot see it, and you don't do any due diligence, you don't think beyond the appearances, you think me a liar. When I told you that that's not what it is, even though you're seeing something, it appears one way, and I'm telling you that it's actually another. Yet in this world, it's akin to walking around in a photographic negative. You see things one way, but in reality they might be quite different, especially in the times that we're in. It's one of the reasons why I talk so much about warfare and meta-warfare at that. I try to explain things across many different disciplines and tie them together to help you understand. It helps me remember the reality that I'm in, and helps me process things in hopes that you will come to understand some things that I understand, and you'll do your due diligence and test them and investigate them instead of just writing them off. But this has been my life since I was born. I've seen certain things, told people, they didn't believe me, and then inevitably it would come true, or they would have enough science that would back it up, or an event would occur that would validate it, and they would see that I was right. Although I can count on one hand how many times people came and apologized. So when I tell you that a lot of things that have occurred to me have had an impact on how people perceive me externally, and nothing does that more than what happens to the frailty of our physical bodies under long duration stress, pharmakia, being poisoned, drugged, made sick, right? And a lot of other complex interactions between psychology, sociological frameworks, interactions. And so when I tell you that let me let this plane go by. Hold on. When I tell you that there's something that has occurred not only to me, physically, cognitively, psychologically, biochemically, that distorts who I actually am, what I see in terms of how I try to explain it to you at times. There are times I'm able to explain it more cogently, like what I am now doing, hopefully. Hopefully it's more cogent. But we all need grace. We all need grace. We need to be willing to see the error of our own ways, and God knows I make tons of mistakes, but I'm willing to learn from them, and I'm willing to take responsibility for them. But I'm also willing to call them out and what's occurring and what's causing them, and expose them, right? But people oftentimes, they're not able to see it, or they don't want to see it, because what they're doing is they're projecting themselves upon others and creating conditions, and they don't realize that the flesh operates like a demonic internet and a projector. Right? People project their darkness on others. They also project good stuff, right, from inside themselves through their own brokenness. But there's oversimplification in this world, right? Especially people that don't want to admit they've done anything wrong, or they make mistakes, or they're fearful admitting it, right? Because they're afraid how others will appear, they'll appear to others, because that's how your fake system functions. It demands you conform to its image, which is skin deep, appearance driven, and doesn't question the reality beyond it. In fact, it incentivizes that. Your entire system incentivizes that. So, consider the things I'm telling you regarding the impacts of COVID-19, regardless of what you think about the validity of the information you've been told. Think about long duration stress and its physiological, psychological, cognitive, right? Sociological implications. And think about the spiritual reality at which I've been speaking about tonight. Think about it. Consider it. Does it seem completely irrational? Is it plausible? Is it possible? Well, how do you know if you don't actually investigate it, test it? So, consider these things and let me know what you think.